Cool. Hey everyone, for those who haven't met me, my name is Daniel Mayhews. I work with the Oasis Center with their College Connection program. And this evening I'm going to be going over college financial aid. So we're going to talk about Financial Aid 101. So for this evening's presentation, I'm going to start by talking about kind of different myths about the cost of college and college expenditures, things that people may think to be true, but may not actually be the case when it comes to a young person in their life going to college. Next, I'll break down the different types of direct and indirect costs and kind of do an actual breakdown of what money goes where when someone is paying for school. Then I'll talk about the FAFSA, which is the free application for federal student aid, and then the CSS Profile. I'll go over those a little more in depth. And there are forms that let people know well, I'll get to it in a minute. And then going to talk about other just general forms of financial support and aid, and then specifically aid available to students in the state of Tennessee and the various requirements for that. So for this, here are some of the, I would say, most common or most prevalent myths. You'll see in this PowerPoint, I do have a lot of text, and that's just for people to be able to refer back to and read. So right now, on the left-hand column of the table, I have just a random selection of colleges and universities. And then on the right-hand side, there's a cost of attendance broken down. It's important to note that these prices are sticker prices. So this is the price tag for what a school would cost, assuming there is no financial aid or financial support whatsoever. And this would be for a given year as opposed to a semester. So the first myth is that community college will always be the best and most affordable decision for a student. And I would say that a lot of times community college is an excellent option in terms of being affordable, especially if a student wants to pursue a four-year degree. Maybe they would opt to do their first 2 years at a community college. But it's important to note that I think it's really important for people to consider financial aid packages, because while the sticker price for a community college may initially be markedly lower, once you look at financial aid, it could be the case that a school with a higher sticker price may actually offer more money for the student if they were to attend. And not entirely relevant to the financial aid portion, but I think it's also good to mention fit for the school, because you want to make sure that wherever someone's going to school, that they enjoy their experience there and that they're able to get the quality of it. Like, we'll just make sure that the programs that they're interested in line up and everything like that. So thinking about the cost versus fit and things of that nature. The second myth is that private colleges and universities are always going to be ridiculously expensive. And again, kind of in the same vein as the first myth that we've talked about, it is true that private universities do have much higher sticker prices. However, a lot of these schools have a very large amounts of money dedicated to being given to students specifically for financial aid. So they're usually able to give more students scholarships and grants. And there are a handful of universities that have committed themselves to covering 100% of demonstrated financial need as seen on the FAFSA. And then the third myth is that there's no way a student will be able to go to school out of state because it would be too expensive. And I would say with private universities, it's important to note that the sticker price is going to be the same regardless of whether or not a student is applying from in-state or out of state. However, with public universities, in-state tuition is pretty much always going to be cheaper than out-of-state tuition. It is important to note that strong applicants, that public universities will be willing to shell out money for really strong applicants and people that they think would really not only benefit from going to their school, but if the university thinks the student will really help contribute to the school and improve the culture. Schools are willing to shell out the money and that kind of thing. So those are, I would say, some of the biggest 3 myths. So next we're going to talk about direct and indirect costs for college. So if you look at the 5 categories below, the first 3, tuition and fees, room and board, and meal plan, all fall under direct costs. And what this means is when a university gives a financial aid package, this is money that's going to go always going to be going to the university when it's paid. So a direct cost is money that a family would be paying to the school, and beyond that, these are things that will always be included in a financial aid package. It is important to note that not every school is going to necessarily have room and board or a meal plan. For example, community colleges often, sometimes never, will have the room and board and meal plan. But any financial aid package that a family gets is going to have those 3 items on it. Indirect costs, however, these are expenses that someone should anticipate incurring if they're going to go to school, but that money earned or the money that is spent for, especially in terms of transportation and personal expenses, won't necessarily go to the school. And then these last 2 items are usually less often built into the financial aid packages, but some financial aid packages will provide essentially an estimated expense of books and supplies and transportation. And so since we've discussed the 5 different types of college costs, both indirect and direct, I want to throw this pie chart up there just so people can have a better understanding of really the size of each expense. So tuition and fees is by far the largest, accounting for almost half of the total cost of college. And then beyond that, there's going to be room and board. And room and board usually the board in room and board usually stands for a meal plan. It's not always the case, but in the case of this pie chart, I believe it is. And then next you have books and supplies, and then personal expenses and transportation coming up. And 10% may not seem like a lot, but it is important if we're talking about costs in the realm of thousands of dollars or things like that. That is something to take note of. So of all the slides that I'm going to be discussing today, this is one that I would like to particularly emphasize. So every student, if they are to be eligible for financial aid, they need to fill out the FAFSA, which is a free application for federal student aid. And essentially, this document exists so that when someone fills it out, it takes, per se, a snapshot of a household's financial information. And then that snapshot is sent to schools that a student applies to. And a school or a university will look at that and then figure out how much, after they see the demonstrated financial need from the family, they will then give a financial aid package to a student. And that will essentially list what the cost of attending the university is, and then how much of that cost is going to be covered through financial aid, either from the institution or from the state or other resources. And then lastly, how much will be paid for by the student or family. And so to fill out this form, it's really important to have, there are essentially two types of information that are going to be put in the FAFSA. There's financial information and then personal information. So assuming for the sake of example, there was one student in a 2-parent household. So if the student worked and filed taxes for the previous year, same with the 2 parents, then they would want to submit their tax returns and then their W-2s, and then depending on the amount, the dollar amount for tax returns and W-2s, to provide more clarity, you may also need to provide things like bank statements or other financial details. You may need to discuss the value of assets as well. And then in the realm of personal information, Both student and parent or parents, dependents, whomever, will need to provide social security number, a date of birth, and an email address. I would also add, most of the time it's going to be helpful to have a phone number as well. And so this personal information is also going to be needed to create the actual login for filling out the FAFSA itself. So these are the most important things that you're going to need. And that is a kind of a bird's eye view of the FAFSA. In addition to, so the FAFSA is not the only form that exists to demonstrate, help students and families demonstrate financial need. There's another form that exists called the CSS Profile. And so is usually the case, some schools will want a more detailed snapshot of the financial situation of a household. And that is where the CSS Profile may come in. So it is going to ask more questions kind of about personal assets, perhaps about rent or mortgages or things like that. And that is so that the college or university, when they see this form, they're able to essentially provide a more accurate and more detailed financial aid package for the student. It's also worth noting that if you are a student, or if you're a household that has a student that is not eligible to fill out the FAFSA, there are some universities that will allow you to generate a student aid report from the FAFSA and then send that, or fill out the CSS profile and send that to the university as well. And I will talk in more detail about students who aren't eligible for the FAFSA at the end of this presentation. So I've mentioned a lot, I've kind of mentioned a lot, universities sending financial aid packages to students. And in this portion of the presentation, I'm going to talk about the things that actually make up this financial aid package. So the four main elements are going to be grants, scholarships, work study, and federal loans. So in the case of grants, this is money that it's essentially free money. It does not have to be paid back. There are many types of grants that are offered by both the state and federal government, or colleges and universities. One example of a grant would be the Pell Grant, which is provided by the federal government. So if a household makes below a certain amount of money, they're automatically going to be receiving the Pell Grant, or that money that does not have to be paid back. And it is not always the case, but it is typically the case that grants are awarded based on financial circumstances or household finances, usually in the form of income brackets. Scholarships, like grants, do not have to be paid back. Scholarships are, I would say, more often, well, I would say they're offered by colleges, governments, and other organizations, often community organizations or local businesses, things of that nature. And while I would say most of the time they are awarded based on performance of some type or merit. So that can manifest itself in various ways. So if you're a student with strong academics, there are many scholarships, both offered by colleges or state government. So usually if someone has a strong grade point average or meets a certain test score, or a combination of the two, universities will usually have money set aside for those students. Other scholarships include like athletic scholarships, usually in the form of sports scholarships. And beyond that, there are also scholarships based on community involvement and service hours. You could also call this volunteering. There are also scholarships that are kind of more identity-based or background-based. So this would be if you are a student who comes from a traditionally underrepresented demographic or background, there may be scholarships available to you that would not be available to other individuals. And then sometimes members within a given group or organization are also going to be eligible for scholarships. So some cases there are religious institutions that offer scholarships, particular community engagement clubs and things like that. So in the previous two slides, we had discussed free money in financial aid. And now we're moving on to talk about money that is not free and is essentially borrowed. So the most common of these is going to be a loan. So a loan is money that has to be paid back. And most students, all students will theoretically be offered a loan through the Department of Education. And there is a cap if you're on the amount of money that a student can take out on a loan if they're a dependent. It's not in the interest of the government to have a student take out too much money, especially if they're dependent. If a student is independent, the amount that they're able to borrow will actually go up. It'll actually be a little higher. And half of not quite half, but a large fraction of these Department of Education loans is going to be subsidized, and then the other half is going to be unsubsidized. So in the case of the subsidized, that loan won't accrue interest until usually 6 months after you've graduated from your post-secondary institution. I should also note while I'm on this slide, in regards to interest rates, through the Department of Education, these government loans are going to have very low interest rates compared to private loans. And it's generally, I would encourage anyone looking at loans to consult like a community organization that does college access work, or a university, or a high school, or things like that, to make sure that loans that are being taken out make sense for the situation. And so work study was something that was mentioned. So I'm going to stay on this slide, but I'm going to briefly talk about work study. So work study is an opportunity where a student, in order to help pay for the expenses for their school, they are able to have an on-campus job, and the earnings from that job go toward paying for their school. And I always recommend students to have a work study offer essentially be provided for them. So on the FAFSA, it'll ask if someone is interested in considering work study. I always encourage people to put yes in that box. And then I will leave it up to them whether or not they want to opt in to do a work study job. And I particularly like work study because when you're employed by the university understands that you're a student first. And while the jobs may not pay as well, they're going to be flexible in how they essentially schedule your work and things of that nature. So that way you're able to balance the work you're doing to help pay for school and then actually going to school itself. And that concludes our section on different types of financial aid. For this next section, I'm going to be talking about money in Tennessee, so different grants and scholarships. So one of the most well-known ones is the Hope Scholarship. And the Hope Scholarship lines up with some theoretical college readiness requirements. So if you're a student in the state of Tennessee who scores at least a 21 on the ACT or has a 3.0 GPA, that student will be eligible for $3,500 for an academic year. And beyond that, there's also a Hope Access Grant, which has slightly different academic requirements. So if you make between an 18 and a 20 on the ACT and have a GPA between essentially a 2.75 and a 3 or a 2.99 in this case, if your income is below a certain amount, which is at $36,000, you can get an additional $875 per semester. So you'll see a recurring theme you'll see in the different types of grants and scholarships through the state is there usually going to be a combination of academic performance and then adjusted gross income or income levels of a household. All right, and then next we have, all right, gonna go back real quick. So beyond the Hope, we also have the General Assembly Merit Scholarship. So this is for students that meet those Hope requirements and have at least a 29 on the ACT and a 3.75 GPA. You're going to actually be able to receive an additional $500 per semester. So not all of these scholarships and grants stack, but many of them do, especially in the case of these merit scholarships. And in addition to the HOPE, there's the HOPE Aspire. So this is for students who are eligible for that HOPE scholarship, which I want to remind you is that 21 on the ACT or a 3.0 GPA. So for students that meet those requirements and come from a household with an income less than $36,000, they get an additional $750 per semester. And then there's the Tennessee Student Assistance Award. And let me move this box real quick. So when a student or when a family fills out the FAFSA, a number is generated called an estimated family contribution. So for this award, it does not look at income level. It looks at the amount of money estimated that a household would need to provide to the university each year. So if a student has below this 5,800 for, well, I guess it is technically a number. If they have below the 5,846 and they've submitted their FAFSA in a timely manner by this deadline, they're going to receive an additional $1,000 per semester. And next, we're going to talk about the Wilder-Nafee Award, which is a grant specifically for schools within the Tennessee College of Applied Technology network. So the Wilder-Nafee Award is similar to the Tennessee Promise Award, which I'll discuss on the next slide. But for students who do want to go to TCAT, they're eligible to receive up to $2,000 per year. And we're also going to talk about the Tennessee Promise. This was a recent initiative through the state that came into effect around, I want to say 2014, or 2015. And the Tennessee Promise exists to provide free community college or a free associate's degree for students. It exists as a last dollar scholarship, and a last dollar scholarship means that if there are other scholarships that a student has also been awarded, it will take those into consideration first and then fill that remaining gap. So a great example, so if you're a student going to community college and some of your schools already being covered by the Pell Grant, instead of the Tennessee Promise covering that full amount for tuition, they'll just pay for anything that is left over. And for that tuition scholarship for the Tennessee Promise, it covers a maximum of $4,300. And the most important thing well, not the most important thing, something that is certainly noteworthy for Tennessee Promise is there are going to be multiple deadlines and requirements throughout the year for students who are applying. So these deadlines and requirements involve attending certain meetings, filling out the Tennessee Promise application by a particular deadline, which I believe is usually November 1st. There's also a deadline for submitting the FAFSA in a timely manner in order to receive Tennessee Promise. So if your student is interested in pursuing the Tennessee Promise, it is important that they meet those deadlines and requirements. And let's see, sorry, there's a box in the corner. I don't know if it shows up on my screen. Great. So for this last slide, I want to talk about tips for undocumented students. So as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, students who have DACA status or have been categorized as undocumented do not have, since they do not have a social security number that can be used beyond work purposes, and since they do not have an A number or a documentation for permanent residency, they're not going to be able to fill out the FAFSA, that financial aid form. So first, well, I suppose second now is if you or someone you know is an undocumented student and is interested in going to college, academic preparation is going to be essential. There are more different private scholarships and different universities that have money set aside, sometimes specifically for undocumented students, as a result of the state and federal government not necessarily providing that money. And so it's important to make sure that as a student, you do well in your courses and maintain as high a GPA as you can, and make sure to get a strong ACT score. You can take the ACT multiple times. So I always encourage students, if they're not satisfied with the score they get, to retake the test. And kind of leading into my next point, there are going to be other financial opportunities beyond the FAFSA. So again, you're not going. Sorry, let me recollect myself. So other opportunities. So there are various scholarships that exist on a national level. There's some that also exist on a state level. So Golden Door Scholarship, that is, I believe, a full tuition scholarship for students who are undocumented or have DACA status. There are also other scholarships like the Equal Chance for Education and QuestBridge and Jack Kent Cook. And these are usually fairly competitive scholarships, but if a student is able to get one, they usually are able. They're usually provided with kind of wraparound support from scholars programs, and then also they're going to have most, if not all, of their expenses for school paid for. And then this last note, I apologize if it is cut off on the presentation. I can't tell if Teams is clipping it or anything. But for this last point, I would say definitely ask for help or support. There are definitely a lot of really excellent community organizations, such as yours truly, the Oasis Center, or Conexión de Americas, and other organizations that not only have a demonstrated history of working with students who have different documentation statuses, but are also very familiar with the organizations and scholarships that help provide funding for undocumented students. So don't be afraid to reach out for help. If you don't know where to turn, talking to a teacher or a school counselor is always a good idea first if you maybe don't have a connection with these organizations. But it's worth mentioning that there are organizations out there who work to make sure students are provided money for school, regardless of documented status. And that is actually the conclusion of our presentation. So I can open the field to questions, and I'll leave this screen up if that is okay. Or should I stop sharing? Does that work?
Yeah, I think that's fine. Stop sharing.
Great. So I'm happy to answer any questions about the presentation we discussed. I know most of the people in this call are already familiar or financial aid experts.
Daniel, so I have a question for you, Daniel. You know, most of the Gear Up students are 9th and 10th grade right now. Not that we have any students on the call today, but if you were working with one of our students and having this conversation about financial aid, how would you advise them to relay this information to their parents, as far as, you know, maybe parents are pushing back, we don't have the money to send you to college. How would you advise a student to go back and just start that conversation around the kitchen table with a caring adult at home?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I genuinely appreciate you asking that. So whenever I'm working with a student and having a conversation about applying to school, I always tell them that just because you apply doesn't mean that you have to go to school. And so in terms of filling out the application itself, it never hurts to throw your hat in the ring, because there's nothing obligating you unless you have signed something in stone, perhaps saying that you're going to Tennessee University. There's nothing obligating you to go there. So I always encourage students to open as many doors as possible for what makes sense to them. Keep options open, like applying for community colleges, you know, four-year public universities, private universities, and then seeing so that way they're able to compare financial aid packages and see what's going to be the most affordable and also going to be the best fit. In terms of communicating the importance of providing that financial information for filling out the FAFSA and things like that, I would say that I would encourage the student. So it might be a tall order, but I would say reach out to a knowledgeable teacher or an academic counselor or a community organization that does college access work, like Gear Up, like the Oasis Center, like Conexión, and see if they can provide assistance in perhaps explaining the importance of providing that financial information. A lot of times, if someone is filling out the FAFSA, there is an IRS data retrieval tool. So sometimes families may not even necessarily need to dig up all of those old documents to fill out the forms. That's not always the case. But again, to recap, I would say, when applying to schools, don't be shy about applying to as many as you see fit, and also asking for fee waivers. Don't be afraid to bring other people into the conversation about the importance of applying for school and filling out the financial aid form. Yeah, I would say those are probably my 2 points. And if there's anything I didn't touch on, JP, please tell me to, expand.
No, I think that's perfect. I think you answered my question. Thank you. And I also want to stress that, families who are going through the financial aid process and receive an award letter that lists all the different types of financial aid that you just went over for us does not mean that that's the end cost, right? You can always talk to the institution that you've dreamt about going to and seeing if they have any other pockets of money. You can exhibit your financial hardships in different ways and have those conversations. So that award letter is always something that is negotiable. It may be only negotiable to a certain extent, but I think our families and our students need to be aware that they can ask for more. They may not get it, but they can always ask for more.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I'm really glad you mentioned that. And because the forms like the FAFSA, just because they provide a snapshot of a family's financial situation doesn't mean that it is the perfect or the most accurate display, because life happens and it's difficult to really map on to. It's difficult to really get the most accurate read on financial need. And so that's why I always encourage people to talk to, again, their like school counselors or community organizations, because they're very familiar with these documents, and also keeping conversations open with the university. So every university will have an admissions officer, and it is their job to help students, essentially to assist them all the way from the application all the way to enrollment and things of that nature. So I always encourage people to bring in as many people into the conversation as they can.
Awesome. Thanks, Daniel. Anybody else have any other questions or points they want to raise for students and families?
Perhaps I will add, as a personal anecdote, I was the first in my family to go to college, and my parents were not familiar with the financial aid process. So I would say for parents, guardians, whomever, it will benefit you to have things like tax returns, bank statements organized and readily available in folders, either year by year or things of that nature. So that way you don't have to, file through rummage through the junk drawer to find the important documents that you need. So a lot of organization on the front end can make filling out these forms easier. And I would also encourage people to make sure that they're writing down important information in a secure place, for example, usernames and passwords. Because of the nature of the security of a lot of financial aid forms and things that you fill out, there are kind of a lot of like security features built in, like security questions. So resetting them can be tedious and take a long time. So the more organization you do on the front end, the easier it'll be to navigate these financial forms.
Great point. Anybody else? All right. Well, Daniel, I thank you so much for being here and being such a great partner with Gear Up and the services that you provide, and how you guys, continue to work day in and day out with our students and students of Nashville and in the community, the greater community, to make sure that they're reaching their goals. So greatly appreciate your time tonight, and thank you.
Thank you. Take care, y'all.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you.